Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Tensions between Russia and the US and its allies of NATO have touched new heights as there is clearly a stalemate between Russia and the US and its NATO allies over Ukraine. US has repeatedly warned of a direct Russian invasion into Ukraine, which has categorically been rejected by Russia on a number of times. However, Russia put forth a couple of demands before the US and NATO allies that included, first of all, that there shouldn't be any expansion of the NATO in the Eastern European continent, and the military arsenal and the installments in Eastern European countries should be removed, which were categorically rejected by the US and NATO. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that their demands had been ignored by the US and its NATO allies. Interestingly, when we saw the repeated calls by the US and particularly its US President Joe Biden and the White House officials of a direct invasion into Ukraine by Russia, it was taken very differently by Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky, who said these repeated calls and warnings are acute and burning, and this could be a mistake as well. Clearly, a stalemate seems to be between the US and NATO allies and Russia over Ukraine. We'll delve deeper into discussion, for which I'll be joined by an esteemed panel of guests today in the studio as well as online. But before that, a production team has prepared a report. Let's watch that first.
Ukraine and Russia's border tensions are pushing the world's peace towards a new Cold War as United States and European fears regarding Moscow's presumed and imminent invasion of Ukraine is heightening with every passing day. Though Russia has denied an invasion but has strongly opposed Ukraine's efforts to join NATO. The calming down of these tensions are seeming more difficult after the Biden administration handed a written response to Moscow in which it rejected Russia's demands to stop NATO's eastward expansion, though opened the door for negotiating arms control measures in Eastern Europe. The heat of this looming Cold War situation was felt in the United Nations when the United States and Russia have sparred over the Ukraine crisis at the United Nations Security Council meeting. United States Ambassador to United Nations Linda Thomas-Greenfield told the Council during an open session on 31st January 2022 that a Russian invasion of Ukraine would threaten global security and warned of horrific consequences if Russia attacks Ukraine. On the other hand, Russia's United Nations envoy Vasily Nebenzia accused Washington and its allies of drumming up the threat of war despite Moscow's repeated denials of planned invasion. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom's Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations, James Karachi, dismissed Russia's denial of a planned invasion of Ukraine, calling Moscow to stand down its troops. Earlier on 31st January 2022, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss announced legislation that would toughen penalties against Russian officials and businesses as well as individuals close to Kremlin in the case of an invasion.
Well, you watched that report. A lot of verbal spat is going on between the top officials from Russia, the US and NATO allies. And is there any chance of this escalation to be reduced through dialogue, or the threat of the war looms large in the near future in the Eurasian continent because of this statement? To discuss this one deeply today, I am joined by Dr. Riffat Hussain in the studio. He's a strategic analyst. Thank you very much for your time at PTV World. And I'm also joined by Mr. Bernhard Zimniok, who is a member of European Parliament. And Bernhard Zimniok represents the German party Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, and is part of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and is also the coordinator in the Committee on Development. I'll begin the discussion with you, Dr. Hussain. So clearly a stalemate, a verbal spat between the top officials of Russia, the US and NATO allies. But on one hand, we see the President Putin saying that their demands which have been put forth, the US and the NATO allies have been ignored altogether. On the other hand, when we saw the response coming from the US and NATO, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was of the view that there was a kernel of rationale and there could be something in the future regarding the negotiations. How do you see, are there mixed signals coming from the Russian top officials?
Well, thank you, Jawad. Definitely both sides are sending mixed signals because the latest, as I was coming to the studio for the program, I heard on BBC as well as CNN that in addition to 85,000 troops that the United States has deployed as a preemptive move to thwart the possibility of Russian aggression against the Ukraine. The President Biden, in consultation with the Pentagon, has also, in addition to these 85,000 troops, they have deployed 9,000 more troops, and which is seen by the Russians as an aggressive move. So that's for sure. The Americans want to make sure that if the push comes to the shove, then they have enough military power, enough military troops to deal with the situation as the crisis escalates. But on the other hand, if you look at the Russian move, it is true that in 2014 the Russians grabbed good part of eastern Ukraine when they invaded the country. But since then, the Russians have been sending a signal to the NATO as well as to the Americans when the bilateral talks took place between Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, and Anthony Blinken in Geneva. So the Russians disavowed that they had no aggressive intention vis-a-vis Ukraine, but the American president insists that these assurances are not credible, and they have said that Russians had given these assurances before, but we have little reason to believe in the credibility of these assurances. So mixed signals are being sent by both sides, and nobody is sure except Mr. Biden, who had predicted that Russian move against Ukraine.
Of course, it has categorically been rejected by Russian officials on a number of times. I'll go to Mr. Zimniok. Mr. Zimniok, what do you think? What makes President Joe Biden so sure about Russia's direct invasion into Ukraine, and just within a time span of 1 month from now, a couple of days before he issued that statement, and from that date, just within a month?
I'm not sure how we can see this statement, because in such a situation as it is now, nothing is sure. That's sure, because things can change every minute, every hour, every 2 hours. So this is a very, very dynamic situation. I'm not talking about like Mr. Biden, about the time frame. Never. Because I made the experience, maybe I can talk about my experience when I have been in Pakistan during the standoffs between Pakistan and India. So it was quite a dynamic situation. In the end, thankfully, it was solved. So I'm not optimistic and I'm not pessimistic. I'm very carefully and watching the situation very, very carefully and very close. This is definitely not helpful to talk about such, let's say, timeframes, because we should solve a problem and not increase a problem. And solve a problem means we have to talk. Well, of course, the European Union, the Americans and whatever, they were talking and talking, especially the European Union, the Commission. They like to establish circles of chair and talk and talk and talk, and there was never a result. And this was criticized by Putin many times, because he's seeing there's something going on the ground, and we are talking. Therefore, as I mentioned, we cannot talk about...
Mr. Zimniok, when we talk about the Russian demands, the three basic demands that they put forth in front of the US and its NATO allies, the supreme demand was no expansion of NATO, and Ukraine shouldn't be included in NATO. So first of all, talking specifically about this demand, why all the demands were rejected by the US and NATO allies altogether, and when we talk about this demand that there shouldn't be any expansion of NATO in Eastern Europe any furthermore, so why the US and NATO allies rejected these at the very first place?
Well, I personally and my party, we are not rejecting this demand, because there is a natural demand from the Russian side. We have to be very honest and not only be party. If we are only a party, so we are harden and strengthen our position. We have to see that we balance the interests. And I think when the Russians tried to get a foot in Cuba, so how was the reaction? And if you see now, I just printed out during we were talking, the circulation, let's say, or the curbing of Russia. So if I am a Russian leader, I had some concerns. And I'm against personally, and you can see all my statements I made, they are recorded in
So
the
if
European
you
Parliament.
think, if you
I'm
consider
against
yourself, Mr.
this
Zimniok,
extension because
beg your
this
pardon for the interruption. If you consider yourself for a moment being the Russian leader, so you consider the first demand as being legit. So it implies that there is non-seriousness on the part of the Western powers.
Well, of course, I'm part of the Western world, but we have to be honest, and that means we have to be honest and to see how to balance the interests between both parties. And what we are seeing when the former Soviet Union collapsed, Western world used the opportunity to extend dramatically. Now, in the let's say in the 2010, Russia comes back to more power and now ask for more influence. We have a certain kind of understanding for the Russian position, and I think this would be to make the situation much more easier. But Putin, I think, he sees a block. He sees only the American demand. We must extend. We want to integrate Ukraine. What this and this and this country. You know, this creates fear. And this creates unrest, and this creates instability in the region.
But Mr. Zimniok, there are people of Russian origin in the eastern parts of Ukraine, and if they don't want to live with Ukraine, they want their autonomy. And if Russia talks about their autonomy, and on the other hand, we see Western powers talking about the autonomy in certain other regions of the world as well, in the same breath, why do you think this is such a dichotomy of approach when it comes to the policy of the Western powers?
Well, we have a certain approach. We have Western values, so-called Western values. I'm facing with these values every day. And I have to realize to stay in different parts of the world, there are different values, there are different approaches to some problems. We have to accept this, you know. I wouldn't interfere in Pakistan affairs because of my values. This is one thing, European Union, the Commission especially, and the Western world is nowadays driven by this demand for export our values, and we do not accept if there's something happens in any corner of the world because it is against us, against our values. We do not care about the traditions or history or whatever. No, we are center focused. We are focused on our own belly, and that's the main problem. I think we shouldn't interfere anywhere.
You are of the view the Western powers shouldn't be interfering anywhere around the world, whatever the problems happen to be over there, whether it relates to autonomy or taking their own country to a certain path, whatever that happens to be. Dr. Riffat, Mr. Zimniok has agreed when he considers himself for a moment a Russian leader, the first demand of no expansion of NATO, especially in the Eastern European continent, happens to be legit. What's your take on that?
Well, Jawad, it's quite evident that when the Soviet Union broke apart in August 1991, a few years later, the Western world, particularly the Americans, were interested in forging a partnership with New Russia. And at that particular point in time, particularly during when Yeltsin was in power, there were certain verbal assurances that were held out to Moscow about the expansion, projected expansion of NATO. And as part of those verbal assurances, the Russians were told that, you know, under no circumstances the NATO's frontiers will reach as close to Russia as is the case now, and particularly two countries were singled out. One was Ukraine and the other was Georgia in terms of the future expansion of NATO. But then West, when the Russians were weak, they took advantage of this opportunity, and they began to openly talk about not only NATO's frontiers extending closer to Ukraine, but also trying to incorporate Ukraine and Georgia as part of their future intentions. That's one thing. And the second thing which is very important is that it's worth recalling that when Hitler attacked Russia under Operation Barbarossa in July 1941, so then they Hitler launched a blitzkrieg attack using Ukraine as a base to attack Soviet Russia. And historians have recorded that when that invasion took place, so it took Soviet Russia, particularly Stalin, who was then the Communist Party chief, at least 2 or 3 weeks to recover from this shock. So Russians, when they talk about Ukraine, they look at Ukraine as part of the territorial defense of Russia and as an integral part. And then, of course, when the Commonwealth of Independent States was formed, it was created in the mid-90s, we had Ukraine, Belarus, as well as Russia becoming part of this. So these facts are very important, and they rankle, and that underlies the fact that Putin has complained in his address to the Russian people that West has totally ignored their legitimate security interests by refusing to move NATO's frontiers up to Ukraine. So that is the background against which. So
that makes Russia wary of the NATO expansion
in
Eastern Europe.
Of course.
And so what makes Ukraine so adamant to be getting included in NATO? Was it the forceful annexation of Crimea back in 2014? Because at the UN, the UK envoy to the UN said that it was an assurance on the part of Russians at that time that we are not going to annex it forcefully, but somewhere behind the scenes they were doing, and finally they annexed Crimea. So this time around, again, Russians are rejecting the allegations, the accusations that there could be a direct invasion into Ukraine, yet there could be any possibility.
Well, it's very interesting because I'm a student of Russian history. If you look at the Russian history, so they think that Ukraine as a country with which, which was at the core of the Russian nationalism, Russian identity. In fact, in about 2015, Putin, in his speech to when he spoke on the issue of Ukraine, he had talked about the historical and cultural links which existed between Ukraine and the Russian state. So apart from that, the Russians' argument is that Ukraine was, particularly you talk about the eastern Ukraine, that was gifted by Khrushchev as a gift to the Ukrainian people, because and since then there was no problem between Ukraine and Russia, and both countries lived,
So when something has been gifted, should the country that has gifted it to someone else, so should they be claiming back that one in the near future, or maybe later on, just because there happened to be sort of a conflict on other issues as well?
But no, but what I am saying is that Russians do not consider Ukraine territory as an inalienable part of Ukrainian sovereignty. So they said that we traded this territory, we gifted it to you in good faith, but now the situation has changed. And in 2014, the Ukrainian issue was because there was a change of government, and the new government, which had a pro-Western orientation, and they were inviting missiles and trade arms relationship with Ukraine. So that rang a alarm bell in Putin's mind, and he said, well, we are going to settle this issue, and Eastern Ukrainians are which happens to be 17%
I'll take
of
Mr.
the Russian nationalists.
Mr. Zimniok's point on this. Mr. Zimniok, you heard Dr. Riffat elaborating the concerns of Russia, especially when it comes to Ukraine. What do you have to say about this?
Well, I think I have to one remark. European Union or the Western world, they are not thinking in long term. They are not thinking in history development, like Dr. Hussain now described. They are thinking more in the very short term. They are thinking in different terms. And this is the problem here in the European Union, to understand foreign cultures and foreign policies. And therefore, we are maximal inefficient. You know, we have no success at all. See Afghanistan, for example. This was a good example. This is the thing. We should indeed, like Dr. Hussain described, have more sensible for the history and the feelings they are resulted out of the history for the current situation. We deny history. You know, our history starts yesterday. This is the main problem. It's a cultural problem. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Zimniok, when we talk about Russian President Vladimir Putin, he's of the view that Ukraine is being used by the West as a tool to contain Russia's development. Do you agree?
Yes. Yes. I think, I followed the so-called civil society in Ukraine, starting in the early 2000s. If you go deep in the details, if you read a lot of studies about it, as I did, and you will see how or who feeded all these civil societies, contained sometimes only a few people, and in the end, and they were incredible much, and they prepared and they paved the road to create this so-called unrest. They prepared, their task is to turn a system into a Western democratic system according our standards. And I think this is definitely wrong. And we have the same experience in Belarus, wherever you're going. This is really a big problem that the Western world is feeding and establish these civil societies. They create, in the end of the day, more problems than they solve, because as I mentioned before, we have to accept these different cultures, a different history, and we have to interact on basis like understanding and make an equivalent balance between our interests. What we are doing, we export our ideology, nothing else, nothing more. And we use and abuse, in my opinion, countries like Ukraine or take Belarus, whatever we are doing, we complain because we want to turn this system. We want, in principle, in my opinion, to topple a system.
So, but on the other hand, we have seen U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken giving out a couple of statements, and he says that the U.S. remains committed to resolve this issue through dialogue, and this conflict, if it happens, it is going to be in the interest of no one. But by the analysis that you have done so far, we understand that there is some sort of a miscalculation which is being done on the part of the Western powers, and that is what exactly has been said by Russian officials as well, that US and its allies want to drag Russia into war.
Sorry, it was difficult now, the connection, so I didn't get you full. Maybe I'm answering wrong. Can you repeat it? Sorry for that.
Mr. Zimniok, the kind of analysis you have done up till now, we understand that by looking at the statements of U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he says that U.S. is committed to resolve this issue through negotiations and dialogue. And this conflict, if it escalates or happens to be on a full-scale level, it would be in nobody's interest. And that is what Russia, on the other hand, has said, that US and its allies are trying to drag Russia into war. So by your analysis, we can understand there is some sort of a miscalculation on the part of the US and its Western allies officials. Perhaps they are making a sort of a mistake in calculating the ground situation there.
Yes, I think so. And I think they think already when we are talking about the early, so beginning of 2000, where the Soviet Union was quite weak, games like that are working. They are working. But now we have a quite different situation. We have a very strong military power here in Russia. They want to come back on the stage in the Europe, in the international world beside China and America. So this is now, if we continue with the same stuff as before, we will fail. Of course, we have to talk, but not to talk according to European or Western style, where we are talking years by years, and there will be no result. In the meantime, the flow underground is going on, like to talk the next time with this country, with that country. Things are not working like this. I have fully understanding in this way. If we talk, we have a fixed milestones where we get some results, and Putin is asking now for fixed results, not about the new circles of chair where we are talking and talking now. And this is a clear signal. And I think now it is really time, because everybody's now beating the war drums. Of course, this is the time where the maximum demands are on the table. But when you are talking, so we will reduce it and find a real realistic solution for both parties. And this must be clear, a balanced solution, not like a minor partner. So we are on the same level in the eyes,
So, Mr. Zimniok, when we talk about the Russian troop buildup along the Ukraine's border, 130,000 troops equipped with all sorts of things that include tanks, artillery, ammunition, and air power. So when we talk about Russian officials, they call it a hysteria on the part of the Western powers. But with this sort of a build-up on Ukraine's border, don't you think that fear or the threat perception in the minds of the US officials and the NATO allies is legitimate?
Well, I see this contingent, the 130,000 troops. I see it, of course, as a big threat. And I see it also as a danger. A danger in this way, because he used now the maximum threat which is possible. It's the biggest maneuver ever happens, I think, since the Soviet time. And this is, of course, a situation where we have to think about. Now the situation is serious. But the situation can be worsened by single small events. And this is the big problem, if there's a single event, things can explode. And if you're living on the brink of a war, don't use your fire. This can explode. That's the problem. Of course, this is a situation, it makes many people headache, me too, because at the situation. But we shouldn't think about, Putin said, I think a couple of weeks or what before, the Western world is all the time talking, and they continue in their policy on the ground. And they see as an obstacle. Therefore, I mean, if you talk, make milestones, say in 3 months' time, in 2 months' time, whatever, in half a year's time, we have a solution. But we accept basically your main demands. Putin had named 12 demands. Of course, this is the maximum he can put on the table. Maybe they fulfill 2 or 3 or 5, whatever, But if we refuse and we only use our regular tools in the Commission in America, we in the Commission we are minor partners. We are not integrated. We are sitting on the cat table if they are really talking. We are only here if we can support later on to make pressure on Putin by embargo or anything like that, where we are bleeding. The Europeans are bleeding, not America. So
Mr. Zimniok, your point is well taken. I'll move to Dr. Hussain. Dr. Hussain, what do you think when we talk about the threat perception by the US and its NATO allies with that sort of a military build-up along the Ukraine's border? Do you think that fear is legitimate?
Well, it is legitimate in the sense that it creates a sense of vulnerability on the part of Mr. Putin, who is calling the shots in Moscow. and his views are shared by his foreign minister and the people who are part of the Politburo, and there is a fear that if Russians, what they are saying are the Russian red lines, which is that the NATO's Eastern European expansion should not go beyond Ukraine. If those warning about the crossing of the Russian red lines is not paid heed to, then everything is open. And there is a number of agreements I could talk about because of the shortage of time. There is a Minsk agreement, there is an Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which encompasses most of the members of the NATO countries. They held out their assurances, and in today's address, Mr. Putin talked about that when they say our concerns are not being addressed, is that Americans have failed to provide written assurances against NATO's expansion up to the Ukrainian border, and that is the critical issue. I think the Americans have to find some flexibility in their approach in dealing with Mr. Putin. Otherwise, the danger of war would remain, the threat of escalation will remain on both sides, and the crisis could, as Mr. Bernhard has said, the crisis could be triggered by a small event.
Dr. Hussain, you just alluded to the fact that Russia wants the Minsk agreements to be implemented in letter and spirit.
Yes.
We know that there was a call between Sergei Lavrov and Antony Blinken, and I would like to quote Mr. Lavrov. He said, instead of escalating aggressive rhetoric and pumping up the Ukrainian armed forces various types of weapons to use US influence on the Ukrainian authorities to force them to fully implement the Minsk agreements. Now, we have seen that Russia had been denying that it's not, the points which are 13 points are not to be implemented on Russia itself, especially when we talk about point number 10, to remove its forces from all those areas where it has annexed those areas forcefully. So we see again the duality of approach in Russian policymakers as well. On one side, they are asking the US to use its influence on Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreement of 2015 in letter and spirit. And before that, they are not ready to take and implement all those points on its own self.
But the interesting thing, Jawad, is that Minsk agreement was signed in 2015. At that time, the Russians had controlled eastern part of Europe, including their naval base, and the Western world entered into this agreement in full realization that Russia was in de facto control of eastern Ukraine. But yet they went ahead and signed this agreement, and the agreements are reciprocal. As you well know that whenever you have a multilateral agreement involving so many countries, then the obligations that each state assumes under those multilateral agreements, those are reciprocal. So the Russians are complaining that West is cherry picking what is in their interest to ignore Russia's what they consider security interests. So I think the critical issue is that how far West is willing to embrace the idea, Putin's idea, that they will not seek expansion closer to Ukraine's border. And once that assurance is given, then the Russians will be willing to open talks and open talk sincerely with the Western world. So there is a perception in terms of resolving this conflict as to how do we read these multilateral agreements and what do they entail.
Mr. Zimniok, what do you say about Minsk agreements? So on one side, we see Russian officials saying that it is not bound by the points, especially the point number 10. If you allow me to talk about this specifically, the withdrawal of all foreign armed formations and military equipment and mercenaries. That also creates a a threat perception when it comes to the US and NATO allies. On the other hand, Sergei Lavrov, in his call with Antony Blinken, urged the US authorities to use its influence on the Ukrainian authorities to implement Minsk agreements in letter and spirit. So clearly two different versions coming from the top officials of Russia.
Yeah, I think, of course, we should everybody, all parties should do their very best to create a situation where we can talk. That means also everybody has to withdraw from his own position a little bit. This is a political game. So this is for me not a real obstacle. The real problem starts later on when we negotiate. If we have 12 points for Putin, where we have to fulfill or 1 point. This is the art of negotiation between the diplomats. But without, let's say, going one step backward and one step backward, to give the other party the impression, yes, they are talking serious. This is my main problem, because the situation is now a little, in my opinion, hardened. It's really fixed now a little bit. And
so, Mr. Zimniok, unfortunately, we are short of time. What do you see in the near future, in coming weeks? Is there any chance of this escalation coming down, or still the threat of a full-scale war looms large over the region?
Well, I don't think that will be a full war, because you know what is the end of the war. We have thousands of nuclear heads around the world. No, I don't think so. We have everybody is interested.
You're of the view there is no chance of a full-scale war because of the nuclear arsenal present over there and installed over there. But when we talk about the military prowess or the strength of Russia as compared to Ukraine, and considering if the Western allies don't come to help Ukraine in case of a direct Russian invasion into Ukraine, what do you predict in future if that war occurs between Russia and Ukraine one-on-one? Which country is going to take that leverage?
I think we are not involved in any case to be in a military situation. This is, first of all, that's in our interest, so European interest, the Western interest. Maybe it can happen, yeah, indeed, that there is some small, let's say, on a small scale. I don't hope so, but this will be part of the negotiation. I think it will be part of the negotiation to put a lot of pressure on the table.
Okay, Dr. Hussain, what do you say about it? Are there any chances that this escalation could be reduced through dialogue in near future, in coming weeks especially, or still the threat of full-scale war, especially between Russia and Ukraine, looms large?
Well, Fawad, in my judgment, the threat of full-scale war needs to be discounted, and I could give you a number of reasons, because not only it will have an impact, adverse impact on the Russian economy, but Russian ability to sell their gas to the Eastern European, that will get damaged, and the Russians are well aware of these risks. However, if the West expects that, in the wake of its response to Russian military buildup, it will force the Putin to single-handedly bring down the tensions, that's not going to happen. The West has to show some flexibility, and Putin also, as part of that agreement, will have to...
Both the countries, the US and Vladimir Putin, Russian president, both need to show some sort of a flexibility. So in order to avert a full-scale war in the region, that would definitely have economic repercussions. Thank you very much for being here in the studio, Dr. Riffat Hussain, strategic analyst, and Mr. Bernhard Zimniok, who is the member of the European Parliament. I really appreciate your time at Views on News. I'll end the discussion today with a famous quote by John Steinbeck, that all war is a symptom of man's failure as a thinking animal. So we expect the leaders of Russia and the US and its NATO allies to come to the negotiating table and resolve this particular stalemate through dialogue. With that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Until the next episode, it's goodbye from me and my entire production team. Thank you for watching.